Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about evaluating the quality of the nutrition facts tables that you've been generating for a variety of different consumer packaged goods. Now, most of you have been taking the formulations that you've been working with and generating nutrition facts tables using ESHA or another database platform. And this is very useful in Canada. Again, so many companies that are out in the consumer packaged goods field think, well, I am designing a new food product. I need to make a nutrition facts table by sending my product out for chemical analysis. That's true in some cases, but for many food products, they're done by database. And irrespective of what method you do, these labels do go through compliance testing on a randomized basis. Now, I'm working directly from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency website, and I do recommend taking the time to refer directly to this website because information from the government changes frequently. But let's walk through some of the content when it comes to identifying, is my label compliant or not? And how does the government evaluate compliance on these labels? So just to walk through this, CFIA wants to make sure that any labels that are done are compliant and are providing factual information to the consumer. Now, we've already talked in our class that many of the labels that you are getting on these food products have an acceptable error variance that's reasonably high. We used the example in class of, let's say you were a Campbell's soup, making chicken noodle soup, and you were buying in carrots for your soup that were contributing vitamin A equivalents through beta carotene. Well, what would happen if you bought your carrots in September at the freshest peak? Well, they'd likely have a lot more beta carotene than if you were buying in Ontario carrots in March or April, carrots that have been sitting in cold storage for 6 months or more. Do we need to go and make a whole new nutrition label? No, we actually allow for a reasonably generous error variance within these labels to be able to account for seasonal and lot-to-lot variation. It's not fair to a food company to have to go and print a whole pile of new labels. So, but that said, they do want to make sure that these labels are factual and reasonably realistic. Too many times I've seen food companies where they'll take their labels and they will cut and paste from another company, and you end up with these errors perpetuating rather than going back to regenerate a new label from the database itself. Or I'll see companies who are doing consumer packaged goods. They're often smaller companies and they're getting their nutrition facts labels from other consumer packaged goods, and they're transcribing that, and the rounding rules start to compound on themselves so that you've got too many transactional rounding issues, from one label being rounded to the next label being rounded to the third label being rounded, and those rounding errors can start to add up on one another. So going back to why consumers want to be making sure that when they're reading these nutrition facts labels that they're factual and realistic so that they're making appropriate decisions about their health and wellness. And so for you as a food technologist working in one of these companies, you need to be aware of the nuances behind designing these labels and how you are going to make sure that these labels are compliant. So compliance in these labels is going to be managed a few different ways. If you are making human milk substitutes, so baby formulas, or other formulated liquid diets, think Ensure or Glucerna, these types of meal replacement products, this is not the same compliance requirements. Those food products, because of the important role that they play in nutrition, they have a much stricter nutrition compliance. So the guiding principle is that industry has the core responsibility behind the labeling. It is not up to the CFIA to be out invigilating and managing this. It is up to the industry to be responsible that things are compliant. That said, CFIA's role is to make sure that that compliance is in place. And CFIA also doesn't want to be out there being punitive unrealistically. If you are making a nutrition facts table for a candy product, it's going to have a much different role than if you were representing a food product that has all of these front of label health claims. So they are concerned about what is the health risk to the public if you are misrepresenting something. What's the economic loss to consumers? They're also looking at, is the company doing this out of negligence because they weren't aware about the rules versus doing it with intent or malice? The CFIA is trying to be on the side of consumers, is trying to be helpful to business. That said, the onus is on the industry. So there's some stats behind this. And again, those of you who are taking my class haven't taken all the statistics yet, but there has been a statistical model put in place to make sure that the sampling and the representation of this product sampling is accurate. Now, I've had a lot of conversations recently with small business about regulations and barriers to trade, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, but the sampling program for a large company is not onerous. They need to take 12 samples, and then they composite those 12 samples into groups so that the chemical analysis is much less. 12 samples for a big company is not a big deal. 12 samples for a small company is a case of product. And that is potentially a large financial loss for the company. And so there has been some conversation about sampling size being more representational to small business. As of right now, as of spring of 2020, this is not the case. We do have to follow the current statistical models. These definitions are pretty straightforward. That lot is the grouped, identically labeled production that's uniform as possible. In many cases, we say a lot is 1 day's production, but you could have facilities with multiple lots of similar product that are produced on the same day. It's 1 unit of production that's identically labeled. Consumer units, those are those primary containers that a customer would buy at their level. That sample is where they're pulling the statistical units from the consumer units. And then they're compositing them. They're at the CFIA's lab. They're going to take those units and pool them together into groups so that they get a more homogeneous sample. All those nutrient definitions, those are within the Food and Drugs Regulations, and we found those in the Guide to Food Labeling for Industry. For all of you who are staying at home and enjoying the extra time that you have on your hands, I highly recommend reading that Guide to Food Labeling for Industry. It is such a rich resource of information. They are using AOAC methodology for evaluating the nutrition content of different food products. Those of you who are taking my class, you will talk about the importance of accredited methods in a later chemistry class. But it's important that the methods come from standardized, internationally recognized methods of analysis rather than just, it's not just someone in their kitchen lab pulling together some sort of chemical analysis. They are done by accredited laboratories using approved methodology, and in this case, methodology from the methods of analysis of AOAC International. The rounding rules, as you know, there are a variety of different rounding rules, and I will let you, on your own time, go through and reacquaint yourself with those rounding rules. If you're using a database platform such as ESHA, the rounding rules are going to be applied automatically for you on the consumer label. Now, this is where it starts to get fun. There are different classes of nutrients. And so in the case of different food products, there are foods that are going to be class 1 nutrients. These are where you are adding it as a fortification, whether that's mandatory or voluntary fortification. In a previous class that we had, we were talking about how some food products have mandatory fortification. That's where the government says you must put this vitamin or mineral in at this prescribed amount. And as you can guess, because the government is saying you must add it, therefore there is additional scrutiny that's in there. And so you can guess also, you likely guessed it correctly, that because of that added scrutiny, they are going to be much more strict with added vitamins or minerals. When it comes to ones that are just there, that are naturally occurring, they're a little bit different. But if you are making a nutrient content claim or a diet-related health claim with respect to that nutrient, then there's going to be a different level of scrutiny as well. And then, of course, you can think, well, what if it's just a label and there's no health claims involved? Different level of scrutiny, and it doesn't even get a name or a class. But again, each of these levels of scrutiny means that there's going to be a different tolerance of error that's permitted. And we've been talking in class quite a bit about how food companies say, is it worth making that front of label claim? Is it worth adding this vitamin or mineral? Because it's a heck of a lot of effort to go and do all of the regulatory gymnastics to be compliant. If you know how to do the regulatory gymnastics, it's not that hard actually, but for many small businesses, it's overwhelming. So now down to sampling. So they're going to take 12 consumer units. So they're going and picking those 12 packages randomly from the lot, and then they're combining them into 3 composite samples with a minimum of 4 consumer units each. So in some cases, they're taking more than 12, and that is in that Appendix 2. And right now my internet is obviously turned off, so I can't link out to Appendix 2. Depending on the quantity of production, that lot could be much larger than 12. However, the minimum number is 12, and then they're compositing it into 3 composite subsamples that are homogeneous in nature. So let's keep walking down here. I'm going to do the theoretical portion in one video, and then I'm going to jump into a second video and walk through some example work. So there are these different cutoff criterion, and this is where there's some mental gymnastics involved. So in criterion 1, this is where they're having different acceptance criteria to ensure compliance. So in criterion 1, what they're looking at is the composite subunit within 50% of the declared value? So, and is it within 50% of the regulatory requirement? So in some cases, the food product must meet a regulatory requirement in terms of delivery of a nutrient. So if it's at least half as large or at most 1.5 times as large as the declared value, that's what we're looking at for criterion 1. So for criterion 2, we're looking at, does it fall within the minimum or maximum level for this regulatory requirement expressed with that allowance, with the rounding rules, with any further tolerance. And you're gonna have a headache at the end of this class. And then criterion 3, this is where there's only a 10% difference from the mean allowable. So a lot of stats going on here. And this, again, this is why many food companies are hesitant to be doing nutrition front of label claims for nutrient content or diet related management, because all of the stats then suddenly applies. So now we're going to jump into tolerances. So for class 1 nutrients, these are those nutrients that are added intentionally by the manufacturer. So this one, you are, I'm having a tongue-tied moment here. The mean nutrient content of the 3 composite subsamples is not less than the declared value adjusted for the rounding. So the declared nutrient value has no tolerance. So if I have to add iron or vitamin C or folate to my product, remember we jumped out to that foods to which vitamins, minerals, and amino acids, etc. must be added. If it's one of those products, there's no tolerance allowed. It has to be that within the rounding rule. Then for nutrients that are not added on a that are not added, they're just naturally occurring, these class 2 nutrients, but there's a claim, then it's a 20% tolerance. So it cannot be less than 80% of the minimum nutrient level required by the regulation, and the declared value on the label has that tolerance of 20%. So the mean nutrient content of the 3 composite samples is not less than 80%. And down here it's saying that the regulated limit for the claim has that 20% tolerance. So it can't be greater than 120% of the maximum nutrient level permitted. So it's also on a case-by-case basis, because there has to be a health risk evaluation. And so if there's a potential that going over or under that limit could somehow be compromising the health or welfare of consumers, then Health Canada may come in and say, you know what, we're going to be more strict on this. In general, I have never seen any examples of that occurring within normal consumer packaged goods, but I could definitely see that occurring in foods for specialty diets, as you were mentioning before, some of these meal replacement products. So I'm almost done the front end of this video, and I'm going to jump out to a second video to walk through some examples. But on those class 1 and class 2 nutrients, where those minimum limits apply, the nutrient content of that sample can be consistent with good manufacturing practices. They do need to be evaluating the health risk. So if it was vitamin C, for example, in general within the public, most people consume far above the recommended daily intake, or the RDI value of vitamin C. Vitamin C in general for most of the public is not a concern from an overage perspective. But if you were looking at things like vitamin A, where there is a potential toxicity, then there may be some concern relative to the health and safety on that product. This is the one piece of the puzzle that's interesting. CFIA is not really forthcoming saying to food companies, you can use databases like ESHA. They know it's out there. They don't go out and push it. But I've had a lot of food companies come to me and say, why didn't the CFIA tell me that I could use a database? This document here, the compliance document, is where they talk about databases. So industry is responsible for complying with the composition and accuracy on the labels. And you can use a variety of different risk management strategies. We've talked about the risk management behind using ESHA in class already, and the potential risks of making substitutions within ingredients, or where filtration or agglomeration steps or dehydration or yield changes could be impacting on the outcome of the label. But if you think about those error tolerances, if you're not making a front of label claim and you don't have mandatory added vitamin or mineral fortification, then the ESHA databases are quite helpful and quite cost effective. But again, that verification is in place, and those tolerances of plus or minus 20% allows for the inherent variability that we see within the lot-to-lot variation of the inputs being used for our manufacturing. And it does allow for you to modify the label to be conservative, so that you're not going to be somehow out of compliance within your labeling. This paragraph here has a lot of power in it, and the CFIA doesn't want to evaluate the nutrition database platforms. They want to be focused on compliance. They don't want to be out in the business of saying this platform or that platform is approved by CFIA or not. And so, as we mentioned in class, many food companies who don't have the cash flow have even resorted to manually calculating in a spreadsheet the values that would be seen in a database, pulling the information from the USDA, the old standard reference 28, now what is it, Food Data Central, or from the Canadian Nutrient Reference Files, and manually calculating what would be in that nutrition facts table, sending that off to the graphic designer. Databases are extremely powerful. Do be aware of that error tolerance. I don't want to be out there saying take advantage of it. I want to be out there saying be compliant, but be aware that that 20% tolerance is normal within these labels. All right, I'm going to stop this video at this point, and we're going to jump out and do some examples in a second video.